Hello there, welcome to the Saroy channel, wherever you are in the world, and so much love to each and every one of you. I do hope you're doing incredibly well. I'm doing great, thank you very much, and I'm so delighted you've joined me for part 2 of our story tonight, because it's a very exciting story, and we're all going to ask ourselves this one question. Who is that girl standing at the end of Molly's bed, a 7-year-old girl covered in a blood-soaked nightdress? Because this is something that sounds a little bit more than a dream to me, and I'm sure we are about to find out what's going on there. So let's continue with part 2 of our story. 20 years later, the Bird Club at Mrs. Pearson's apartment in Manhattan. So tell me, Hannah dear, did the little girl with the blood-soaked nightdress go away? Did she leave your daughter Molly's dreams or not? Asked Mrs. Sanderson in bewilderment, as she curiously listened to Hannah Pearson's extraordinary tale. All 6 very close girlfriends lived in the same Manhattan neighborhood. They were gathered around a beautifully set luncheon table in Hannah Pearson's dining room, listening to her account of her daughter Molly's tempestuous nightmare that she had experienced as a 16-year-old girl on many occasions. They were seemingly so caught up in the grip of the story that everybody had stopped eating at once. You couldn't even hear the rattle of cutlery or the tinkle of a wine glass. They had been particularly interested in Mrs. Pearson's husband's account of the cantankerous old man, Mr. Philip Croydon, standing at the end of her husband's bed when he was all but a little boy, who eventually, on discovering he was dead, had agreed to go to the light. It was almost as if Hannah's bewildering story had resonated with all of them in some deep clandestine way that they could not even understand themselves. The 6 women, calling themselves the Birds, got together once a month for a bird club luncheon, and everyone took turns to host a luncheon from one month to the next. Every woman in the bird club had to choose to be a bird that reflected their personality and was representative of them in some way. Mrs. Pearson had chosen to be a robin redbreast. She was so passionate about the Christmas season and was always cheerful and jolly. So it goes without saying that she hosted the traditional Christmas lunch every year. Mrs. Janice Sanderson was a flamingo, as the woman was very leggy and always wore pink wherever she went. "My husband can't abide pink," she explained once to her friends. "In truth, he absolutely abhors the colour. He says he'd like me to wear other colours for a change, but I refuse to. I love pink." "Nothing wrong with that," said Mrs. Pawley. "I mean, if you like pink, and you wear it. We all have our quirky idiosyncrasies that make us unique. And maybe if your husband was so attracted to you from the very beginning, he really does like pink on a subliminal level, although he's not actually prepared to admit it. That's my guess anyway," said Mrs. Pawley. She paused for a moment to reflect over her words, and then said with a chuckle, "As long as you don't make him sleep in pink sheets under a pink comforter at night in an all-pink bedroom, your husband will do just fine. I'm most sure about that." "I wouldn't worry about his reaction to pink if I were you." Mrs. Sanderson flushed in embarrassment, her skin matching the pink cotton dress she was wearing. "I'm afraid my bedroom is all pink," she admitted coyly. "Is that really so dreadful? I mean, my husband knew I was a slave to pink when he married me all those years ago. So it's rather too late to complain about it now, don't you think? I mean, he knew what he was getting into when he married me." "Maybe he thought you'd grow out of your obsession with the colour," said Mrs. Pawley. "I mean, it's usually little girls fixated on pink, is it not? Not women our age." "I don't think I've ever grown up," admitted Mrs. Sanderson. "That's the trouble. I'm a perennial little girl, a girly girl at heart." She returned her focus back on Hannah Pearson and the interesting subject that they had been discussing. "I want to get back to this fascinating ghost story. You have us completely intrigued, Hannah. Tell me, did the ghost of the girl in your daughter's nightmare, wearing the blood-soaked nightdress, go away? Did your husband's advice he used on Philip Croydon help your daughter at all? That's what I want to know. Hannah Pearson, the ever-attentive hostess, was busily preoccupied filling up the fluted wine glasses of her guests with yet more alcohol, and was momentarily disengaged from the conversation. "No more for me," said Mrs. Pawley, looking horrified at the thought of drinking yet more wine. Mrs. Pearson was an excellent hostess, but Mrs. Pawley had a low alcohol tolerance and could get easily bladdered. She had no intention of making a spectacle of herself at lunch. Besides, if you were too drunk, you could lose focus, and Mrs. Pawley was enjoying the light-hearted banter around the table. She resolutely covered her wine-glass with her hand. "If I drink any more wine," she told her hostess obsequiously, "I'll be staggering out of here like an inebriated drunk, and I need to be able to focus when I get home. I still have to make dinner tonight. I promised the kids we'd make pizza," she told them. All eyes at the table remained focused on Hannah, as they waited for her to answer Mrs. Sanderson's question. "You ask a very interesting question," said Mrs. Pearson. "Molly was 16 years old at the time. She's now 36, would you believe it? Doesn't time fly when you're having fun? I mean, where did it get to, I ask you? My Molly, bless her cotton socks, is now happily married. Her husband is being transferred to Minnesota. The company is starting up another branch over there. Anyway, to answer your question, she never did see the girl in the blood-soaked nightdress again. Well, she did see her one more time. The very next night, as it happens, after my husband had given her his seasoned advice. The girl came out of her closet, appeared at the end of her bed and said, 'Please help me. Please will you help me?' My daughter said she just got out of the bed in her dream, not really physically, if you know what I mean, and directed the girl back to the closet. She said to the little girl, 'You must go to the light now. I can't help you. I believe you're dead. I'd be grateful if you leave me alone.'" Mrs. Sanderson took a sip of her wine, tapping the glass with her long pink manicured fingernails. "What happened next?" she asked eagerly. "Well, would you believe it, the girl in the blood-soaked nightdress smiled at my daughter Molly in her dream and said, 'Oh, wait until you're ready to help me. The name's Jacqueline, by the way. Everybody calls me Jackie.' And she was gone, just like that. My daughter never saw her again. We were never awoken at 2:32 in the morning again. My daughter was astounded that every time she entered our bedroom after that harrowing nightmare, the time on my husband's bedside clock was always 2:32. Molly believed the numbers were significant, but she had no idea what they meant. It's been 20 years, so I'm very glad to say my husband's technique worked very efficiently. It was a turbulent time that year. Restless, sleepless nights were common back then. Being frantically woken up in the middle of the night by Molly. I'm afraid Clark did see the little girl as well," Mrs. Pearson admitted. "He'd been teasing Molly relentlessly about being such a scaredy cat about her nightmares. You know how mean teenage boys can be. Clark was no exception to that rule. He was a terrorist, he really was. Loved making fun of his sister. I remember he was tirelessly putting cockroaches in her shoes. That was one of his absolute favourite pranks. Then there were the fart cushions, of course, that he'd put on her chair. So when she sat down, she made those horrendous farting noises at the most inopportune moments, usually when we had guests, which of course would make my son roar with laughter. But yes, he began having exactly the same nightmare, where the little girl stood at the end of his bed and said to him, 'Please help me, please help me.' I think this happened after Molly had told her to go away. Let me tell you, Clark did not handle it well. He was worse than Molly was. Terrified he was by the little girl. But then he took my husband's advice and told her to leave him alone and go to the light, that she was dead. So she said to him, 'Don't worry, Molly will help me when the time is right, 'cause you're not as brave as she is.' Which, of course, he didn't take very well. A teenager, especially a teenage boy, doesn't like being called a coward, let me tell you." Mrs. Sanderson cupped her chin in her hand, rubbing a hand over her eye in a self-soothing gesture. "That is some story. It gives gives me quite the chills. What do you suppose the little girl wanted? She kept saying, 'Help me.' Do you think she'd been murdered by someone and was seeking vengeance on her murderer?" "I have no idea. Maybe we'll never know the answer to that question," said Mrs. Pearson. "I think we can conclude that something rather bad happened to her when she was alive. I'm in no doubt, well, at least I assume she was a ghost visiting my teenagers in their dreams. But what happened to her we'll never know." "So you then think it was a ghost?" asked Mildrew, who fancied herself as a cuckoo, and had chosen to be a cuckoo at the bird club, which was a given as the woman was very partial to cuckoo clocks that she ordered regularly from Switzerland, from a stunning catalogue she received in the post. One of her walls in the kitchen was devoted to a stunning display of over 24 cuckoo clocks. Hannah Pearson had jumped out of her skin the very first time the bird lunch had been hosted in Mildrew's kitchen, when all the cuckoos at the stroke of 1 in the afternoon came bounding out of the clock singing cuckoo in an instantaneous orchestra of birdsong. So shocked was Mrs. Pearson that she unscrupulously jerked her wine glass, splattering red wine all over her white dress. Everybody had cracked up laughing, most especially Mildrew, who was delighted that everyone had been terrified out of their wits by her benign collection of cuckoo clocks. The hilarious event was a long-standing joke among the birds of the bird club. It would seem that in the aftermath of that lunch with the red stains on Hannah Pearson's white dress, the stained dress rather reminded her of her daughter's insidious dream, of the ghostly apparition standing at the end of her bed, in a white bloody nightdress, saying, "Please help me! Please help me!" When she had left that luncheon at Mildrew's house that day, in her seemingly blood-soaked dress, she had been able to see that little girl in her mind's eye very clearly, standing at the end of her daughter's bed, saying, "Please help me!" And it had left Mrs. Pearson feeling unsettled for days on end, almost as if a fragment of her daughter's insidious nightmare had also been haunting her. "You asked me if I think it was a ghost," said Mrs. Pearson. "That's the $100,000 question. My husband Hugh certainly believes it was, given his harrowing experience with the apparition of Philip Croydon, and of course his family's genetic tendency to be rather sensitive to the paranormal. I'm not sure if it was a ghost, but I think it may well have been. Let's just say it was certainly a bizarre experience that has confounded our family for years. But I guess in life we have to accept that some things will never be explained, that mystery is part of the fabric of our lives, which makes them all the more fascinating, don't you think?" "Ostensibly," said Mrs. Pearson, not mincing her words. "Let's not kid. A life without mystery would be a very dull life indeed. And as a society, we hunger for mystery, do we not? I mean, think about it. When Agatha Christie died, she left an estate to her daughter of over $600 million, which makes Harry Potter seem like a cheap cousin by contrast, as J.K. Rowling never made that kind of money with her books. But magic never compares to mystery, does it? Mystery writers, well, they make us ride the waves of a very exhilarating journey. It goes to show how hungry people are for mystery. We love it. It brings our lives so much more meaning, so much excitement and anticipation. Is it not the not knowing that we're titillated and teased about? It is the same kind of enticing allure as waiting for our Christmas stocking to be filled when we're kids. I mean, look at you, Janice. The moment I started telling you about Molly's strange dream, you were sitting at the edge of your seat in excitement. You were practically drooling to hear all the details. That's because you're intrigued by mystery. To be fair, we all are, said Mrs. Pawley. It's quite some story you've told us. But you're absolutely right. Do you know, I think nothing in this world is more exciting than a mystery. And I have a funny feeling your daughter's story isn't exactly over yet. You said that the ghost actually told her, "When the time is right, you will help me." "Oh, please don't say that," said Mrs. Pearson. "If I never hear about that little girl in the blood-soaked nightdress again, It'll be too soon. This is a mystery that can remain unsolved as far as I'm concerned. You have no idea how tormented both my teenagers were about her. I just hope she found her peace. That's all I can say about the matter." "Well, she's still fresh in your mind," said Janice, "because we're actually talking about her right now." "Well, I never thought of it like that," said Mrs. Pearson. "Good point, Janice. But then again, the story is shrouded in mystery. That's why it intrigues you all so much. We're all wondering the same thing. Why was that girl covered in a blood-soaked nightdress? Who was she, if indeed she was a ghost, visiting my daughter and my son? And you all want to know why. Why did she single them both out for her attention?" "I'm sorry, but it would freak me the hell out if I was to ever see a ghost," interjected Lauren Swanson. Her bird of choice had been an owl, and it suited her favourably. She had wise old brown eyes and wore rounded glasses that made her eyes appear all the more round. Furthermore, she spent copious amounts of time reading. She was passionate about guessing the murderer in all the crime novels she read. In truth, she was as sharp as any mystery writer. She sagaciously figured out the twists and turns to the plots she read, with a marvellous rate of accuracy that was nothing short of astounding. Mrs. Pearson wisely never asked Lauren who had done what in a novel she was reading, because if Lauren was reading the same book, she'd always get her predictions absolutely right, and therefore spoil the story for Mrs. Pearson. "I can't imagine what it would do to me," said Lauren. "It would freak me the hell out. Please excuse my unladylike language. You know, once when I was a girl, I'd go and stay at my friend's house. Her name was Trudy Wellington. Now they lived in an old Victorian house in old Louisville, Kentucky. This was about 3 blocks away from St. James's Court, where there are some stunning Victorian properties for over 40 blocks. I was raised in that part of the world, you see, before we moved to Manhattan. I'm glad to say I grew up in a modern house myself, not too far away from the old Louisville area. Mrs. Wellington, Trudy's mother, told me there was a ghost child in their old Victorian property. They'd often hear the child's laughter. I hated staying there, but my parents were close to the Wellingtons and took it in turns babysitting us both. So I was often expected to stay at the old Victorian house when it was the Wellingtons' turn to take care of me. Let me tell you, this place was haunting. The perfect place for a haunted location, with a creaking staircase, floorboards that groaned and heaved when you even walked over them, old plumbing that meant if you opened a tap, the entire house would rattle and shake from the vibration in those racketing pipes, and hearing those in the middle of the night would freak me out. Worse still, the rooms were so dark, very dark, ominously so, decorated with hideously dark ornate wallpaper in deep scarlets and dark greens. The house had high ceilings, fancy cornices and big windows that didn't let in much light. I never understood the lighting phenomenon and why it was so dreadfully poor. But it didn't help that they had heavy curtains in every room and formidable dark austere furnishings that made the place very oppressive. I remember I shared a bedroom with Trudy Wellington, as there was no way on God's earth I was going to sleep in that bedroom on my own. We would hear exquisite piano music in the night, coming from downstairs, but nobody was ever there. Trudy and I would tiptoe cautiously across the landing and surreptitiously sneak down the long sweeping staircase to check the music room for ourselves, where her mother would often play the piano. Her mother was a novice at playing the piano, so she wasn't desperately good, but the music we heard from that music room was magnificent, as if it was being played by a proficient pianist. We would quietly, very gingerly push open the heavy ornate door, but no one would be at the piano. But that room was so icy cold, it felt like we'd entered a refrigerator. When we left the music room to return to Trudy's bedroom, the piano would start up again, playing all on its own, and we would often hear a child's laughter, as if something or someone was toying with us mischievously. But believe me, I never found it remotely funny. It scared the bejesus out of me, it did. Trudy was used to hearing piano music playing in the middle of the night. It happened so frequently,
and Mrs. Wellington claimed she often heard a beautiful singing voice filtering through the house. But I never heard it myself, thank God. I was freaked out enough whenever I slept in that house. I promised you I'd cover my head with a comforter and refuse to answer a call of nature, unless Trudy came with me. I was so afraid of seeing something physically. I mean, hearing the music and the laughter was one thing, but I couldn't have stomached seeing a ghost of any kind. Old Louisville in Kentucky has a huge, illustrious and vibrant history. Lots of people living there have ghost stories to tell. But staying at that old Victorian house was one hell of an experience, let me tell you. It creeped me out, it did. And now that I'm significantly older, I'd never willingly stay there again. Trudy's parents, the Wellingtons, still live in that house, but she moved away from there a long time ago. And when she goes to stay with them, she always hears the piano in the middle of the night, and the mischievous tinkle of a little child's laughter. And her children have heard it too. And one of her kids asked her who the little boy was running up the staircase. So I'm guessing that they've physically seen one of the ghost children there. And that, I am so glad, was not me. My brother saw something very strange in a graveyard once, said Mildrew. It was actually in a cemetery in the outskirts of New York State, in a heavily wooded area where we lived at the time, would you believe it? In a really nice traditional wooden house. My brother was only 15 years old at the time, and like any other boy his age, he loved ghost stories, just as much as the next boy. I mean, let's not kid. Who doesn't like a good ghost story? Sometimes my brother Keith and our next-door neighbour, a 16-year-old boy called Christopher Edwards, would creep to the old cemetery at the dead of night, as the place was not too far away from our home. And nobody would be about, because they were so determined to see a ghost. It was like a resolute fixation with the both of them. Funny enough, my brother was never into Halloween or the bogey man. Not stuff like that, because it's fictitiously make-believe as far as he was concerned. But he adored the idea of encountering a real ghost. If my parents had known my brother was slipping out at the dead of night to go exploring an old graveyard, they'd have literally given birth to kittens. My father was not the most amenable man, but then he was the headmaster of a private all-boys school, so we were all a little afraid of him. He was a tad intimidating. The boys at the school he attended were terrified of him, because my father had a booming voice that would make glasses in a bar literally vibrate. He'd say something like, "Why are you running down the foyer, young man? Explain yourself." And the little boys would tremble in their boots because of his authoritarian voice that demanded respect. My dad could look at you with his steely grey eyes, and if you'd done something wrong, you'd fall apart in front of him at the seams, like a ball of wool unravelling. My mother used to say my dad had missed his vocation in life. Ostensibly, if he was a police interrogator, he'd get the prisoners to confess to all their crimes at a drop of a hat. You could never lie to my dad, so it was best just to keep secrets from him. Me and my brother were good at that. My brother Keith was so slender at 15 years old, he could enviably wiggle and squeeze through a narrow window in his bedroom. I was small and thin too at the time, but I couldn't get through that same window like he did. My brother told me it was all about technique, in getting your body at the right angles to get through the window, and I never figured out how he did it. He made it look so effortlessly easy. Suffice to say, when he exited our house, he'd stuff his bed with pillows so my parents would think he was fast asleep in his bed, when in reality he was out painting the cemetery red, so to speak. You know the saying, be careful for what you wish for? Well, it certainly applies in these circumstances. My brother was 2 years older than I was. He begged me to come to the cemetery at night with him and Christopher, but I was a wet blanket and refused to go. I was genuinely terrified of seeing a ghost, but my brother loved being scared out of his skull, and I kind of admired him for his brazen confidence and assertiveness. He told me I was a scaredy cat and a little wimp, but in truth he could have called me all the patronising names under the sun, and I wouldn't have cared a toss. There was no way in hell I was going to go exploring a graveyard at the dead of night. I'd been there during the day on a plethora of occasions, and that was bad enough. The place freaked me the hell out. I always felt that we were not alone there, and that something in the dark shadows was watching us. There were trees fringing the woodgrove, so anyone could have been watching us from a distance, and we'd never have known it. This very gloomy graveyard was abandoned, neglected, forsaken and desolate. There was overgrown grass everywhere, weeds rambling all over the place, vines that were getting out of control. Some of the grave markers were incredibly old. They were no longer tethered to the ground. They looked like old crumbling teeth that had rotten and fallen away from the gums. Many were covered in moss and lichen, so much so that the names had been wiped away from the markers, which I found terribly sad. Some of the graves, even 100 years on, were still remembered by some people, as some had plastic flowers in vases placed in front of people's graves. I never liked those plastic flowers. They'd fade and get awfully dusty. It would have been better to plant some perennial flowers in front of the grave and hope that the rains would bring them back every year. Even during the day, I was incredibly reluctant to go to that depressing, bodeful place. But my brother always dragged me along to these places like a skittish little puppy dog. By all accounts, Keith had a macabre fascination for the paranormal, and a graveyard is your first port of call if you're looking for ghosts. My dad also knew about his fixation with ghosts because he'd chuckle and say patronizingly, "There's no such thing as ghosts, Keith." My brother would get quite upset about it and say, "How do you know?" And my dad would say, "Because I know." My brother would say that that was the stupidest answer that he'd ever heard in his life. To presume to know something was insane as far as he was concerned. Nobody had a monopoly on knowing everything, and my mother heartily agreed with him on this, and so did I, for that matter. My father was a know-it-all kind of man who believed he knew the answer to everything, when he probably didn't know very much at all. If I'd believed ghosts did not exist, then I guess I might have accompanied my brother to the graveyard. But there was no way I was going to a foreboding, sinister place in the dead of night like that. In my opinion, that was madness and was insane. My brother would meet up with his friend Christopher outside the house at about midnight, I believe, and they would be on their bicycles and the two of them would cycle to the graveyard together, except during the winter months when it was too cold to get out of bed. Then my brother was not quite so brave. Mildrew gripped her glass tightly, as if she was in that graveyard herself in the dead of night, for it seemed even recounting the story gave her an attack of the heebie-jeebies. I tell you, when Keith told me this story I'm about to share with you, I didn't sleep for days, I was so freaked out. Let's just say, on this night in question, my brother had gone through the usual routine, begging me to go with him to the graveyard. "Be a sport," he'd say. "For goodness sake, Mildrew, have some guts, will you?" "Do I have a complete wuss for a sister? Is that what you're telling me?" he said to me. But as usual, I predictably declined his invitation to go to the graveyard that night. It was autumn, I do remember that, and a lot of the lofty trees that fringed the road had relinquished their leaves in large pillows of golden confetti that were spectacular to look at during the day, but at night not so much. My brother said it was very, very dark that night, and the naked boughs of those trees looked hideously grotesque, like gnarled hands reaching out to grab you. There were no street lights on our street, but there was a full moon. My brother believed a full moon might bring out some wayward spirits from their graves. He had warped ideas running through his head, but then again so did his friend Christopher, who might have been more obsessed by ghost sightings than my brother was. The two of them were like peas in a pod in that regard, and let's just say all these years later, they're still very much the best of friends. There was a cool wind blowing that night. The summer had teetered into autumn, so the temperatures had plummeted considerably. My brother was warmly dressed with a scarf and windbreaker, as was his friend. When they cycled along the windy ribbon of asphalt, the icy wind whipped against his face, and many of the autumn leaves danced in the breeze as if butterflies were flying around him, while prisms of moonlight dappled the road and rudely brought out some of the ambiguous shadows out of their hiding places. My brother and his friend were carelessly not wearing protective bicycle helmets on their heads, as you would never see a car on the road at that time of the night. It just never happened. It was sequestered, let's just say. So there they were, blissfully riding their bicycles rather nonchalantly towards the graveyard. It was about a 10-minute bicycle ride away from where he lived, forming the cul-de-sac at the bottom of a wide road. The wrought iron gates of the cemetery were rusted and unkempt, the gate barely standing up on its hinges. The graveyard was bordered by an old-fashioned stone wall that was crawling with vines and moss. It was almost as if the natural world had taken over this graveyard. I don't think it had been tended to or cared for in many years. My brother would say his heart galloped with excited anticipation, as he emphatically believed that on this night it might be the very night when something outer-worldly would actually happen. And let's just say on this occasion he was not wrong, as something spectacularly outlandish was about to occur, but they had no way of knowing it. Keith and Christopher gingerly parked their bicycles against an old stone chapel that was as derelict and forsaken as the yard itself. It was a pity it had been abandoned, as it had great potential to be a lovely chapel with arched stained-glass windows and church pews, where the padded upholstering had become the homes for many mice, and there were some ancient Bibles that were bloated and falling apart in their pews. The graveyard was like an all-you-can-eat buffet for the owls. My brother would see owls perching on the tombstones when he arrived at the cemetery. Their yellow eyes would fiercely scan the graveyard for any signs of mice running between the markers. They would squawk excitedly, launching out their landing talons as they grabbed the mice between their claws. They would perch on the stones, callously diving into the flesh of their quarry with a frenzied enthusiasm, and my brother and Christopher enjoyed watching them. They were never intimidated by the boys' appearance in the yard. My brother enjoyed a smoke while he was in the graveyard, and he watched the stones with his friends to see if they could see any sign of paranormal activity, although, let's just say, what they were expecting or hoping to see, I'm not entirely sure. "It feels weird in the cemetery tonight," my brother told Christopher. "Maybe there is some truth to the full moon bringing out the unmentionables from the bowels of the earth." "I feel it too," said Christopher. "In truth, I had an unsettling feeling that maybe we shouldn't have come to the graveyard tonight." "You did?" said my brother. "That's so cool. That means something is going to happen, and we should be here tonight. We might just experience something for a change. We've been coming here often enough. We deserve to see something." "You say that every time we come here," said Christopher, "but nothing ever happens, I might remind you." "So you want to give up coming here? Is that what you're saying?" "Absolutely not. I like coming here with you. Besides, even if we don't see something really wacko and disjointed, it's cool watching the owls hunt for mice. But it would be way cooler if something outlandish were to happen. I want to be scared out of my skull. I'd like an encounter with the Headless Horseman, wouldn't you? That would be cool." I kid you not, as my brother and his friend Christopher Edwards were discussing this, they suddenly heard these disembodied screams coming from the woods that fringed the cemetery. My brother said it sounded exactly like a woman being murdered. There was nothing else they could say to describe those ear-piercing screams. "What the hell is that?" said my brother, stabbing out his cigarette into the ground, pushing it into the soil with his boot, to ensure all the smoking embers had died. My brother and Christopher Edwards did not know the meaning of the word intimidated. They didn't stop to consider those screams, like most people would. Indeed, most sensible people would say, "Let's get the hell out of here. Something doesn't feel right." But no, not my brother, and nor his friend Christopher Edwards. The terrifying, bodeful screams were like the tempting bait at the end of a fisherman's line, and they were biting that bait hungrily, being drawn towards the sounds, like moths towards a bright light, or like a lamb to the slaughter, if you like. The boys' hearts flapped with excitement, as if their chests had become a butterfly colony. They ran straight towards the woods. They were certain the screams had come from the disembodied ghostly apparition that they suspected they'd see. They were hoping to spot the phantom floating through the woods. My brother was struck immediately by how hauntingly airy the woods had become, and for one who was not intimidated by anything, the wood grove did not feel welcoming to him at all. But as I said, he didn't care. Both boys carried flashlights with them, and even as they ran through the woods, They were staggered by the darkness that upholstered them from every side. Believe me, the woods were bodefully inauspicious, very overgrown, tangled by creepers, vines, and hundreds of saplings trying to weave their way through the trees to compete with the larger ones that were more established. They tried to brazenly steal the light from the forest canopy. The floor was indulgently littered with fallen leaves, twigs, shrubs, ferns, and of course logs that had fallen over and were now covered with lichen and moss. It was a precarious obstacle course walking through those woods, especially during the dead of night, and my brother's clothes kept getting snagged by thorny briars. But he and his friend clandestinely moved towards the screaming noise that eventually morphed into an argument where they heard voices shouting at each other, and the voices got louder and louder as they made their approach. And then they took cover behind a large oak tree. They were in for the shock of their lives, as if they'd been flung into an alternative reality. They were wondering what the hell it was that they were seeing. So there we are. That's the end of part 2 of our story. Part 3 is tomorrow night, and it's getting very exciting, so I'm looking forward to you joining me then. Until next time, goodbye and good night.